Hello and welcome to the second lecture on McCulloch versus Maryland. I just got done recording this lecture, and right at the very end I made the mistake of saying thank you for listening to this lecture on Marbury v. Madison, and I've had to go back and redo the entire thing. There are a lot of cases that have very similar names, and sometimes I do get a little confused. There's Marbury v. Madison, there's McCulloch v. Maryland. I don't mean to confuse anyone, and I'd like to keep things straight. So let's get down to business, talking about the legal reasoning of the court in McCulloch. Remember, our first lecture was about the circumstances that led to this conflict that brings this case to the Supreme Court. And it began with talking about why the states were so upset about a Bank of the United States. The United States starts regulating the economy and conducting its business through this second Bank of the United States. And this makes the states very angry. It's costing them money because the United States is no longer depositing all of its revenues and for its budget and for expenditures in state banks. Most of the banks in the United States are incorporated by the states at this time. And so they see the Bank of the United States as a threat. And banking interests are very powerful, and just like today, those bankers start lobbying their state legislatures to limit the national power in favor of state regulation. And they focus on this Bank of the United States because if they can win this case, then all sorts of other limitations will apply in other areas to the national government. So when this case arrives at the Supreme Court of the United States, coming directly from the Supreme Court of the state of Maryland, Maryland makes two arguments, and these arguments are related to the two issues we're going to define in just a moment. The first thing Maryland says is that the United States cannot create a bank because there is no power that enumerates the power to create a bank. There's nothing in Article 1 that says explicitly or expressly the United States government can make a bank. And then they sort of hedge their bets on the second argument. Okay, even if we lose the first argument, even if the U.S. can make a bank, states can tax the bank, they can tax entities of the national government because states are sovereign in and of themselves. They have retained their sovereignty and they can tax businesses within their borders. Now, as I noted earlier, Chief Justice Marshall writes the opinion in this case, and he addresses these two issues and links them to specific clauses in the United States Constitution. The first issue, of course, is does Congress have the power to charter a national bank? And he links this to an interpretation of the necessary and proper clause. Secondly, did the state of Maryland exceed its power by trying to tax a federal entity? And he links that to the supremacy clause. So he's giving the initial interpretation to two important clauses. And he answers these questions, the court answers these questions. Yes, Congress can make a bank, and yes, the state of Maryland exceeded its power by taxing that bank. And Chief Justice Marshall writes the majority opinion. This case, the first issue is the one we're going to focus on most in this lecture. And it really links implied powers to the necessary and proper clause and gives an interpretation to the necessary and proper clause that elevates implied powers to a very important status within the constitutional framework. He says, even the 10th Amendment omits the word expressly. Now, the earlier version of the 10th Amendment that was part of the Articles of Confederation, it used the word expressly. But the 10th Amendment reads, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So the word expressly would have occurred right before delegated. The powers not expressly delegated to the United States. But it doesn't say that. It just says delegated. This means that the powers delegated can be expressly or implied. They can be enumerated or implied. And this means that the power to create a bank is an implied power that Congress can retain for itself and that the Constitution actually delegates to the United States government. After saying this, Marshall makes a very interesting argument. He says that the contract that the Constitution creates is between the people and government. The people ratify the Constitution, not the states, the people. And yes, the people may have met in their states, in their state ratifying conventions, to consider ratifying the Constitution. But that was just, according to Marshall, that was just convenient. I mean, we could have held an election, right, and said an extraordinary majority, 66% or 75% of the people had to vote to ratify. But we didn't do that. The people decided to meet in their constitutional conventions just out of convenience. The real power here is the people. Then he says, this is also just a brilliant argument, the 10th Amendment is not at issue because it refers to powers not granted to the federal government. Remember, it says powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states. But the power to regulate the economy was expressly granted to Congress, and Marshall's just told us that the power to create a bank is implied out of that express power. So the 10th Amendment doesn't even apply here. It's a brilliant argument. Now, moving on to the second question, just briefly, Marshall says that, okay, so the Congress can create a bank. Can the states tax it? He says no. The Supremacy Clause bars them from doing so because where the national government acts, it is superior to the states. Not that the states are no longer sovereign, but that the national government is superior, and state actions may not impede valid constitutional exercises of power by the federal government. Think about it. If he didn't make this decision, then the people of the state of Maryland could act in any way they wanted to frustrate the will of the rest of the people of the United States. So which the people is supreme? The people who create a state, or all of the people of the United States who create the national government? He says all of the people. A couple final notes. Remember that I said the 10th Amendment eliminated the word expressly. Thus, states may not impede the federal government even when exercising an implied power. That's a good summary of his logic with respect to the 10th Amendment. And then he says, never forget it is a constitution we are expounding. Never forget it is a constitution we are expounding. What does he mean by that? I struggled with that as an undergraduate. I didn't quite understand it. It occurs to me that what he's saying, if you think back to our lecture on chapter 1, he's using a structural analysis. He's saying no one part of the Constitution should frustrate the people's will in creating a national government capable of achieving its goals. And the primary goal of the national government is to create a more perfect union. And of what does that more perfect union consist? A broad national economic regulatory policy. That's part of it anyway. And so this is a structural analysis that the Chief Justice engages in part. Now, he uses more than one, that's for certain. But this particular quotation refers to his overall view that the Constitution should work, all of its parts should work together as a well-oiled machine that work consistently and don't tear each other apart. All right, that's the second lecture on McCulloch v. Maryland. I got it right this time. Thank you very much for listening.